Hello, my online friends. Welcome back to D_Rock_YT. Today, I am going to be talking about Bill C-11, the Online Streaming Act, and what it means for Canadian podcasters, streamers of all sorts. And trying to get to the bottom of what Canada is doing. Please pray for Canada. We have so many things going on right now, and the Liberal Party seems to be bent on pushing more and more censorship against people that disagree with them. There's a lot of rumors spreading online about this particular bill because it seems to be creating the beginning of a registration for all online streaming, where the government is going to start regulating it like it does with current broadcast television. So right now in Canada, the CRTC, the Canadian Radio and Telecommunications Commission, regulates broadcast TV, so all the main news TV, and that regulation seems to be coming now to the internet more and more. There's Bill C-18, which came out. We're going to talk about that a little bit, and just how that's ended up with us losing news on Facebook and like all meta. So Instagram, Facebook, no more news. Google's now threatening to remove Canadian news because Canada, the Canadian government, wants to charge for the news being shared on these social platforms. Pray for Canada. So that so far, Bill C-18 has not been working out well. What I'm going to do is I'm going to tap into a bunch of brighter minds than me on this, because there's some great discussion going on online about what this means, and reading between the lines of what the actual regulation says and what the Minister of Heritage, I believe, is the one that's predominantly speaking on this, which is Pascale Saint-Onge, I think is her name. I don't know how you pronounce it properly, but she has been speaking to it, trying to defend what it is, but every time she does, there's like inaccurate statements made, and people are like, well, this also applies to these people that don't seem to be mentioned in what you're saying. And so anyways, let's just get down to it. I'm going to start with Viva Frey. He does a really good job of kind of summarizing what's been going on. So let's have a listen in. I'm going to just check the volume levels, make sure we've got enough volume. I'll switch to this view here.
Now, all that to say,
oops,
the hell was I talking about? Oh yeah, in 2021, ran for office, didn't succeed. Then I ran for the country, then I ran from the country, or I was pushed out of the country, because they were contemplating...
He lives in Florida now.
And they did, in fact, bring back Bill C-10 to regulate online content, but they called it Bill C-11 this time. And this time they rammed it through.
That's right.
They had like midnight hearings.
So it was Bill C-10 originally, and it was kiboshed, and this was at the time of elections back in 2021. Now they've changed it, updated it to Bill C-11, and pushed it through months ago, with the understanding that there would be some more regulation added to it as it goes. So here we go.
To add modifications, they jammed this piece of legislation through the legislature. And at first, they specifically included an exclusion. It's going to sound a little confusing because there's like negatives and positives. They included an exclusion into the law that said it would not govern individual social media user accounts. They included an exclusion to protect individual social media users. In the dead of the night, always under COVID, because that's how tyrannical governments pass tyrannical laws, like they did with the Order in Council restricting a bunch of thousands of firearms after the Nova Scotia shooting. In the dead of night, the lying tyrannical liberals remove the exclusion they included to protect individual social media users. They remove it. The public gets wind of the fact that the Liberal government removed the exclusion that would have protected social media users, individual social media users, and Stephen Guilbeault, criminal because he's in fact a convicted criminal for having caused mischief for eco rights by scaling the CN Tower, He comes out and when grilled on it says, no. We don't, the Online Streaming Act is not intended to govern individual social media users' accounts. To which the reporter says, well, then why did you remove the exclusion? We didn't need the exclusion. If anybody hasn't seen the interviews, you can go and get the reference. He says, we're not going to, we don't want to target individual social media users' accounts. Then why do you remove the exclusion? Later on, they admit, yeah, we're going to go after individual social media accounts, social media users' accounts, if they act like broadcasters. So they passed this Online Streaming Act, Bill C-11, which is going to regulate the internet the way the government regulates TV and radio, create requirements, language requirements, Canadian content requirements, fees, et cetera, et cetera. They passed the law. They say, how is this law, what's going to be the scope and breadth of this law? Well, we don't know yet. So Pablo Rodriguez, who's the new minister of, I think he's the new minister of Heritage, Pablo Rodriguez, who had replaced Stephen Guilbeault, he says, well, we don't know how this law is going to be adapted and applied. The CRTC, the Canadian Radio Telecommunications Commission, that governs the application, is going to set out the directives as to how they're going to implement this law and the scope of the law. The CRTC just yesterday comes out with their directives, at least.
So he's saying yesterday, this is a previous recording. It was actually last Friday. So right before the weekend, late afternoon, these new regulations came out, added to Bill C-11.
It's one of them. Let me get the article. Hold on. That's not where the article is. That's the 30,000-foot overview. For those who don't know what I'm talking about. Now you know. They come out with their ruling yesterday. What are the new? And I'm pulling up. No, I'll go with CBC first, and then I'm going to go with Michael Geist, a Canadian lawyer who's breaking this down. Here we go. CBC News. Never met a piece of censorship legislation that they didn't like. This is what they have.
It's true. Because they're never the ones censored.
CRTC registration for podcasts and streaming companies draws criticism. That's the headline. That's called the byline, whatever, the underline. Social media users not required to register with regulator, but some services will be. I think my understanding is this is not accurate either. If a social media user has a podcast and generates more than $10 million, either in revenue, gross or net, I forget, they will have to register. So it's not the case that there is absolutely no social media user that will have to register. If you are a social media user, as far as my understanding goes, who's fortunate enough to have a podcast that generates over $10 million in revenue, you're going to have to register with the government. Well, why wouldn't you have to register with the government? This is the new left, the new liberals. Shut your mouth and support the war in Ukraine. Endless war. Shut your mouth and take the jab. Endless support of big pharma. Shut your mouth and accept the censorship. Endless support of big government. And now they're like, yeah, of course you should have to register with the government. Liberals. Yeah, liberals are the new fascists. Or maybe they were always the old fascists. Social media.
Okay, so obviously he's got strong opinions. But he's not wrong. The ratcheting up of levels of insanity is just getting ridiculous. So I just wanted to take a look at the actual legislation here. This is from, so this is the CRTC. September 29th was when this was issued. On the Online Undertakings Registration Regulations and Exemption Order regarding those regulations. Summary. The Commission announces that it has made the Online Undertakings Registration Regulation. Further, the Commission has established an exemption order respecting classes of online undertakings in relation to the registration regulations. As a result of the new registration regulations, the new exemption order, various online undertakings that broadcast audio-visual content that is intended to inform, enlighten, or entertain must be registered with the Commission and provided with basic information no later than November 28th, 2023. Such services include streaming services, social media services, subscription television services that are available online, radio, television that live stream over the internet, services that offer podcast, free or paid subscriptions, and services that offer unique transactions allowing the users to stream or download content. Exempted from the new regulations are online undertakings that are either alone or as part of the broadcasting ownership group that have less than 10 million in annual broadcasting revenues in Canada, and those whose single activity and purpose consists of providing either video game services or audiobook services. For the sake of clarity, users that upload content on social media platforms are not subject to the Broadcasting Act and therefore will not need to register. The registration regulations will be published in Canada Gazette Part 2 and will come to force on September 29th, the day that this is issued. A copy of the registration regulations is set out in Appendix 1 to this regulatory policy. The exemption order is set out in Appendix 2. It makes note here that for sake of clarity, users that upload content to social media platforms are not subject to the Broadcasting Act and therefore will not need to register. So that sounds great, right? Okay, so it doesn't apply to the individuals. It only applies to the companies like YouTube, Rumble, Netflix, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, whatever it might be. It applies to them if they have 10 million or more in revenue. However, there are some streamers that have more than 10 million in revenue, potentially. So potentially it's going to apply to them. They will have to register. The problem with this is online streaming is not the same as a broadcast television network. The programming is not controlled by the streaming service. The streaming service just offers a platform for individuals to produce their own content and stream their own content. So what's going to be regulated? De facto, it's the streamers. It's their content that is going to be regulated because that's what the online streaming services present. It's not their own content. It's the content of the users that use their platform. So here's the problem. Yes, it's only them that have to register, and it is just a registration at this point. So basically they're creating a list, but that's kind of a precursor to them enforcing regulation, which is going to affect broadcasters. Now, Viva Frey mentioned Michael Geist, who's a lawyer, I believe. So I recommend following him on Twitter. This is one of his tweets here. He says, Heritage Minister Pascal Saint-Onge, Bill C-11 does not regulate users or podcasters, producers. So he's comparing a tweet that, or a statement that Pascal Saint-Onge made versus the CRTC bill, which says it applies to users or podcast producers that host their podcast on their own website, but we think most will be exempted based on revenue threshold. So remember, 10 million is just the starting point. We know that this will change over time. This is what always happens when the government steps in and starts to control something. They start to expand that control more and more, and they justify it through some means of, well, you know, we can't not regulate this when we're regulating this. That would be irresponsible of us, and we need to further regulate. The minister, this is her here. She says, Mr. Speaker, is simply false. The bill does not regulate users or people who produce podcasts. What the bill does is make sure that tech giants such as Apple, Spotify, and Netflix pay their fair share. It supports our Canadian creators and make sure that Canadian stories are heard and that our creators have a voice online. Instead of kneeling in front of tech billionaires, the leader of the opposition should stand up for artists and our creative sector. So Pierre Poilievre had already made a statement. This is a statement from the House in her response to it. And then what Michael Geist did here was he just pointed out that this is part of the actual bill, Broadcasting Act. Individuals that host podcasts on their own websites or make them available on subscription service platforms other than social media service are not explicitly excluded from the Broadcasting Act. So they're not excluded under Section 2 321. Nevertheless, the Commission expects that such individuals, i.e. individuals that transmit or retransmit their podcasts through their own websites or that otherwise upload their podcasts to a service available on the internet, would not be required to register because their annual revenues, in most likelihood, would be below the proposed exemption threshold. So basically they're saying, so we don't think that there will be any personal streamers that will be affected by this. Another top voice on this has been Andrew Layton with True North. And I wanted to listen to him because he kind of goes into it in more detail too, summarizing what it really means and how it is censorship. And he's actually been in a bit of a tweet battle argument with a guy that I respect a lot, Billboard Chris, who's a guy who, stands out on street corners with his billboards saying children can't consent to puberty blockers, stuff against the trans activism. He feels that he has freedom of speech in Canada. And so Andrew Lawton has responded to him and, said, here's why you don't actually, and why you could find yourself in a situation in Canada where you're not allowed to share freely on different topics that the government disagrees with you on. And this is happening more and more. People are being arrested. People are being forbidden or blocked or charged with mischief or all types of different things for standing up against what the government's narrative is. So here's Andrew Layton, and we're just going to listen in as he describes, and I'll have the links to these videos as well in the description below. Remember, please like and subscribe to this channel. I am coming on here to kind of build an audience of people that are interested in news, but also in gospel-related information. I want to present the gospel in different ways, but I also want to touch on topics that are important, and I'm in Canada, so this is important to me, and I think it's important to the world because there's a lot of, like, even the EU has some similar laws coming into effect, and there's some kind of worldwide trends that are happening. So it's not just Canada, but Canada seems to be paving the way in a lot of this legislation that's stepping over the line. So let's take a listen.
This is not a particularly surprising development. We've known this was coming, but we didn't know exactly what it was going to look like. And why that's so important is that one of the warnings I gave when C-11 first came up, one of the warnings I gave was that so much was left to the regulations. So much was left to how the CRTC was going to interpret this law and put it into effect. So we didn't actually get to see the full scope of what C-11 was going to do when the bill was being discussed, debated, and eventually passed. The announcement that came out just like on a Friday before a long weekend, which is always how you know they want to bury it, was the CRTC putting out its requirement for podcast networks and streaming services to register. Now, they had a few criteria. You have to operate in Canada, which simply means you have to be accessible to Canadians. It doesn't have anything to do with where you're headquartered or registered or where your CEO lives. It is, are Canadians able to access it on the internet?
So that's an interesting point. The bill does not make it clear that it's only companies located in Canada. It's whether Canadians can view the content, which it's the internet. So how far does this reach? Well, it would reach any service that streams to Canada, reaches Canadians. The government is going to try and register and control any platform with 10 million or more revenue that reaches Canadians. Oh boy.
Internet, which basically means yes, because we do not live in a repressive North Korean style dictatorship, at least not yet. The other part is that you have to have $10 million in revenue. Now, I've spent a fair bit of time going back and forth with some people on Twitter about this, because this is kind of being used by the government and by supporters of what the CRTC is doing as an excuse to say we're not going after the little guys. We're not going after independent content creators. We're just going after companies that have $10 million. We're just going after companies that have $10 million in revenue. Now, this is impossible to separate from individual content. It's impossible to separate from individual content. And the reason for this is because if you are a streaming service or a network that offers podcasts, like, let's be real here. The government is saying streaming service because they're going to make you think about Netflix and Crave and all of that. But when they say that, they also include any website that offers podcasts. So that's Apple Podcasts, that's Spotify, that's Amazon, which has a podcast division, all of these different outlets. How can you offer to people a regulation of networks without offering regulation of the content on those networks, the content available on those streaming services? And that's the part that the government is leaving out here. Pascale Saint-Onge, who's the new heritage minister, she has the unpleasant task of defending this legislation, has tweeted out as though this is just like this perfectly fine, hunky-dory thing. Oh, the Online Streaming Act is just giving you more Canadian stories. It's supporting Canadian music, television, and cinema. It gets global streamers to pay their fair share. So they want Mr. Beast to pay his fair share, I guess, or something like that. No, they're not just talking about Netflix and YouTube and Amazon and Spotify. They're talking about anyone whose show is available on those platforms. Let's just take the politics out of this entirely and focus only on the ideas that the government's using here. Let's just take them at face value that this is about more Canadian content. Well, all of a sudden, we're talking about manipulating Canadian content. On YouTube, it's easy to see how this would happen. YouTube manipulates its algorithm. They have to serve up a certain quota of Canadian content. It's going to be government-approved Canadian content, of course, and they want to include in that diverse voices and all of that. But you also have, beyond that, the question of what it's going to look like on podcasts. So right now, if you go on to Apple Podcasts, which perhaps you've done to get to this show, you'll see a whole laundry list of recommendations. Maybe for Black History Month, they say, here are Black podcasts. Or for Pride Month, they say, here are gay-themed podcasts. Or in general, they say, well, you might like true crime. So here's a true crime series or something else you might like. Okay, well, that's all fair and reasonable that they're trying to tailor their selections based on what they think people are going to like. Well, now government's coming in and saying, you have to serve up a certain amount of recommended content that we like. I joked yesterday about like the non-binary Franco-Indigenous quota or something, which, you know, some variation of is going to exist. But what's happening here is the reality of this. The reality of this is that government is going to be picking and choosing winners. Yep. So sure, maybe the government is not saying under C-11, the CRTC is directly regulating the Andrew Lawton Show. But make no mistake, by regulating the platforms on which this show relies to get to its audience, the government is regulating this show. In the same way it's regulating Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan, one of the most popular podcasts in the world, if not the most popular podcast in the world, it's not Canadian content. So it's going to be on the losing end of this regulatory environment. So yes, the CRTC is absolutely regulating content because they're regulating what content can be accessed, how content can be accessed. That's exactly what they're doing here. And they're doing all of this while trying to tell us that they're not. That's what's so disingenuous about it. And I'm afraid to say some people have bought into this hook, line, and sinker. You take for...
Okay, so what he's saying is bang on. The problem with trying to regulate an online streaming service that presents content from online streamers is that YouTube itself doesn't have content. Well, I mean, there's like an old video that one of the directors of YouTube put up. So there was some content on there from YouTube itself, you know, and they have their own instructional videos and stuff like that. But that's not what Canada is going to be regulating. This is to put in a CRTC regulation for the content that is on these channels and By de facto, that means the users themselves are going to be regulated. Yes, it's just the companies that have to register when they have 10 million or more in revenue per year. Revenue. That's not like net. That's gross revenue, I believe. The regulation is going to trickle down, and it's going to end up affecting the algorithm. The algorithm will prefer certain videos that meet the Canadian criteria. If it even goes, like, the thing is, if Canada enacts a law and forces this, there is going to be rebellion, like it's happening right now with Facebook and Bill C-18, where they will just refuse. So Facebook, Canadians, you may not know this, but Canadians can no longer get news on Facebook or Instagram. If we try and post a link to Canadian news, I think it's just Canadian news, I should test that, it gets blocked. It can't be shown on Facebook because Canada is trying to force a paid service. So Facebook has to pay for any links to news on their service. So this is Bill C-18. And what's happening is Facebook, Meta, including Instagram and Facebook, and Google and others, as it gets rolled out more, are just saying, okay, we're not going to show news then. Canadians won't be allowed to view Canadian news on our platform. How about that, Canada? Is that what you want? That's what's happening. Canada is trying to regulate a freedom platform and make it government controlled. And this is going to backfire on the Liberals. Well, I mean, people are starting to wake up that the Liberals who are supposed to be middle of the road, or have that appearance, are really going to extremes. They're becoming extreme socialists, where they control everything and they take control of your bodily rights. They take control of what you can see, what's misinformation and disinformation. They tell you what it is. They control your speech. They control what you can view as entertainment. That's where this is heading. And this follows on the heels of Bill C-18. And I've got a little article here. This is from Michael Geist. He gives a reality check on Bill C-18. So this is the one that's affecting our news in Canada. So he says, this is from September 20th. He says, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was asked this week about concerns with the implementation of Bill C-18, to which he responded that other countries are quietly backing Canada in its battle against tech companies. I posted a reality check tweet noting that Meta is not returning to news in Canada. The law's regulation stipulating a 4% fee on revenues is not found anywhere else, and that Bill C-18 has emerged as a model for what not to do. With the House of Commons back in session, it is worth providing a more fulsome reality check on where things stand with the Online News Act. So this is Bill C-18. While the government is still talking tough, the law has been an utter disaster, leading to millions in lost revenues, with cancelled deals, reduced traffic for Canadian media sites, declining investment in media in Canada, and few options to salvage this mess. For those that took the summer off, Bill C-18, oh wait, I got to move this one over. Sorry about that. Bill C-18 received royal assent in late June. Over the past 3 months, Meta has blocked all news links in Canada, cancelling existing deals with Canadian news outlets. The blocked links covers both Canadian and foreign news. Oh, it does include foreign news, in light of the broad scope of the law. While the Australian experience lasted a few days, the blocking in Canada has now gone for weeks, and there is little reason to believe that the company will reverse its position to comply with the law by simply not linking to news. The government responded to the blocked news links by stopping to advertise on Facebook. So, you're not going to show links, we're not going to advertise on you. And encouraging others to do the same. The boycott has had little effect, as the Liberal Party is still advertising on the platforms with a new round of ads this week. The Prime Minister is still posting on the platforms, and reports indicate that Facebook has not experienced a reduction in user activity. In fact, Reports suggest that the experience on Facebook without news has improved. Further, a Competition Act complaint has not sparked any action. Google responded to Bill C-18 by advising it too would remove news links from its service before the law takes effect in December. So the law is officially not yet in effect, but it's coming fast, and Facebook reacted right away. Google's about to react on it. That position enabled it to wait for the government to release a draft regulation that provide further detail on the application of the law and the standard for obtaining exemption from the mandatory bargaining process that can lead to the final offer arbitration overseen by the CRTC. The draft regulations, which caved in some key issues, were released in early September by New Heritage Minister Pascal Saint-Onge. The government envisions Google and Meta paying at least 4% of search or social media revenues in Canada for a minimum of $234 million. Given the approach in the regulations that the percentage is likely higher, I think the Liberals are just trying to pay down some of the massive debt that they've caused in Canada. So the regulation only require that some of the money be spent on journalism, and its approach to fair compensation means that the CBC is likely to be the biggest beneficiary. Oh, surprise, surprise. The CBC is our Canadian state broadcaster funded by the government. And in fact, all our main media sources have received and are receiving funds from the government. CBC is the main one that's predominantly funded by the government. So of course it's positive to government news and regulations, and the propaganda is real in Canada. So CBC will be favored in this law, in these laws. The government's estimates from the law are now more than 50% higher than they were less than 1 year ago. No other country in the world has established what amounts to a 4% link tax. In fact, the 4% figure was never discussed at committee in Canada. The effect of the news link blocking in Canada has led to smaller and innovative services laying off staff or stopping all new hiring. Some report losing as much as 50% of their website traffic. Wow. I know like local news outlets, which predominantly use Facebook, right here where I am, our local news, they're like trying to do other ways, like using their stories to show a picture of something that relates to the news, and asking for comments. They're trying to get around it, but of course they can't actually just publish stories on Facebook. And that's one of their key bread and butter for how they got their message out. So CRTC has established a timeline for it to address Bill C-18 regulations that stretch into 2025. In fact, there can be no mandatory bargaining under the law until certain CRTC regulations are concluded, which it says will not happen until late 2024 or early 2025. News Media Canada, the lead lobbyist for Bill C-18, has now told the government that it wants the temporary support measures such as the labor journalism tax credit extended and expanded. The group is seeking government tax credits equal to 35% of labor costs. When combined with the roughly 35% envisioned by Bill C-18 in the unlikely event that both internet companies reach agreements, the groups want 70% of news costs paid for government or through government regulation. I think that's supposed to be by government. The Canadian approach has not taken off elsewhere. A California bill was delayed until at least 2024, while a U.S. federal bill may not have sufficient support in the House of Representatives. New Zealand introduced a bill, but with an imminent election, it will not pass. Meanwhile, Australia is now preparing for the expiry of the original 2021 deals between Facebook and media outlets, with many expecting that Facebook will not renew the agreements as it shifts away from news worldwide. Looking ahead, there is little hope that Meta will return to news in Canada. If Google follows suit, no internet company will be subject to Bill C-18. Even if it does reach agreement, it will not be enough to compensate for the lost revenue and traffic from Meta. In the meantime, investment in the sector has ground to a halt. Canadians have lost access to news on social media, and small independent media are particularly hard hit. Avoiding the Canadians' outcome is now a top policy priority in other countries looking at media legislation. So we've become an example for what not to do. Congratulations, Canada. Thanks, Justin Trudeau. Your Liberals are just making this country great. There's more I could say on this. I recommend following Michael Geist. Oh, here's Google's update. This is from June 29th. And they just talk about, they're likely not going to share news. They're going to participate in the process to try and get regulations changed. But if it comes down to it, they're just not going to participate in it. So that's where we're at. Please pray for Canada. We need help. Please help. We have an election coming up in 2025 that's so bloomin' far away. Why can't it be 2024? It's not. It's 2025. Right now, the polls look like Pierre Poilievre of the Conservative Party is leading by a vast majority across Canada because he is not down with the ridiculous things that are going on. The inflation, he wants to fight inflation. He wants to get housing starts and building construction going in Canada much greater so that our huge housing crisis gets settled out, where prices are just ballooning out of control. People can't afford to pay their mortgages, and inflation and interest rates are just crushing things. Carbon tax expected to come out soon, adding on to the ridiculously priced gas. I took a picture of gas here in BC. Let me see if I can find that. Is it going to focus? Yes, look at that. That was me at the pump the other day. Regular gas, 206.9. Premium, 232.9 cents per liter. That is insane. And they want to add the carbon tax to that. Pray for Canada. We need help. We need help. And we need change. We need change to happen fast. Otherwise, we are going to be told what we can listen to, eating the bugs, living in pods, unable to afford rent. Oh, man. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe to support this channel. I'd really appreciate it. I broke the 100 subscriber goal. I'm now stretching for that 1,000 goal, and I'm hoping you guys will support me in this. God bless you, and yeah, thanks for watching. Bye for now.